belief. And we're going to see that at the end of the day, it was successful. Just kind of a tangent that I sometimes get on. It just boggles my mind when some people think that Jesus could ever have been unsuccessful at anything. Right? He's God. He's God. It's impossible for him to fail at a task. Right? Because he's God. Now, people say, well, some people he taught and they didn't listen. Well, that's because it would violate his nature as God to take away our right to choose. Right? We always have a choice. And so when you say, well, he taught this person and this person didn't listen, well, that's because that person failed, not Jesus. Right? Jesus presented the message perfectly every time. It's just that some hearts were not open and willing to accept it. So Jesus never failed at anything. And I'll only bring that up because there are people that believe that Jesus is yet to establish a kingdom. And so you say, well, how do you come to that? Well, many times they go to John chapter 1. He came to his own, those who were his own did not receive him. And they say, see, He came to set up a kingdom. He was going to be a king then, and he wasn't able to accomplish that. He failed, and so he set up the church, and the church is here to kind of fill the void or stand in the gap until he's able to come back and set up his kingdom later that will be for 1,000 years. Well, if you go on to John chapter 1 and verse 12, he says that those who were his own, he gave them the right to be sons of God. So there were plenty who didn't believe, but there were also plenty who believed, and he established a kingdom on that day. You know, in fact, when later on we're going to find that Pilate is going to say, "Are you a king?" And he's going to basically say, "Yes, my kingdom is not a threat to your kingdom." In fact, if people realized what the gospel teaches about obeying those who have that civil authority over you, they would want more Christians in their kingdom. Because Christians are wonderful citizens. Because we understand that God established the civil law to keep order on this world, and He gave us a responsibility to obey it as long as it doesn't violate His teaching, right? But to teach that Jesus came and failed is just laughable. It's just absolutely laughable. Jesus never failed. Humans fail. All humans fail, right? Because, number one, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we all fail spiritually at some point, right? And we all fail physically. We are not going to live like this forever. The flesh was intended to be temporary. And many of us, I would say a large percentage of the people in this room, have reached the age where you begin to understand that the flesh is not forever. Because parts of the flesh have already started giving us problems and falling short, haven't they? And we begin to experience that and understand, okay, this thing it's not permanent, right? And to be quite honest with you, I don't want this thing to be permanent, right? I've done things to this thing that make it sometimes uncomfortable. Life has happened to this thing to make it sometimes uncomfortable, right? And so it's here to hold what matters of me until that time where this box, I'm released from this box, right? And turn free into my eternity. And so that's the thing that we're holding on to. So this is kind of the idea. Jesus, of course, prays, and he's talking to Martha, and I read that Jesus pointed Martha, I thought this was a wonderful quote. Jesus pointed Martha from the corruption of the tomb to the glory of His promise. Right? You know, he says, he'll live again. Well, I know that He'll live again at the resurrection, you know. And so he's bringing her to that place, and then he's bringing her into this even greater understanding of who he is and what he's capable of. Like we said last time, how do we know that Jesus can raise us at the end of our lives? How do we know that he has power over death? Because he raised on the third day, yes. But what else? I mean, that was him, right? He raised himself, which shows tremendous power. We understand that. But how do I know that he can raise me? Because he raised Lazarus. He went to Lazarus' tomb after 4 days. I mean, he's already starting to decompose. And he said, Lazarus, come forth. And what did Lazarus do? He obeyed the voice of Jesus. He came forth. He came walking out of the tomb. Impossible. With man, it is impossible. But with God, what? All things are possible. A body that's laying in a coffin is going to stay in a coffin once it's in that vault and once it's buried under 6 feet of dirt. But we don't stay dead. We don't stay dead. Isn't that amazing? That's amazing. Verses 41 and 42 of John chapter 11, if you look here with me. They removed the stone, then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. Remember we talked about this last week, and we said there are some people that hypothesize that if Jesus hadn't said, Lazarus, come forth, that every dead person in that cemetery would have raised up from the dead and come walking out, right? And that sounds neat. That's one of those things that you see on a meme or you see in Facebook and you think, oh, what a cool thought, right? But it's not reality. Jesus wasn't there to raise everybody in the cemetery. That wasn't his plan. It wasn't his purpose. How do we know that it wasn't his plan? Because look at the prayer that he prays right there in verse 41. He says, I thank you that you have what? Heard me. Is this present tense or past tense? It's past tense, isn't it? I thank you that you have heard me. Not that you're going to hear me when I call Lazarus out of the tomb, but we already had this plan set up. When was the plan set up? Well, I honestly don't know. Was the plan set up when he heard that Lazarus was sick, when he was over there with his disciples? Possibly. Because he knew Lazarus was dead when he found out he was sick, didn't he? Because he said, he's asleep. Oh, well, sleeping, he'll be all right. He's dead. Remember that conversation? I mean, did he come up with the plan on the way? I don't think he came up with the plan on the way because he told them that it wasn't going to end in sleep or in death, right? He said, it's not going to end in death, but it's going to end in my glory, is what he told them, right? So he knew then that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. I mean, we could push it back all the way to before the foundations of the earth. It could have been known in the mind of Jesus that it was going to happen even back then. I don't know what I'm telling you. I don't know exactly when they made this plan together. But I do know it was before he showed up at the tomb, and it was before he said, Lazarus, come forth. Right? So he prays this prayer, and he prays it audibly. Right? Obviously, he prays it audibly. How do we know that he said this prayer audibly, and this wasn't something that he prayed in his mind? Why does he say that he prays this prayer at the end of verse 42? Yes, that others will believe, right? Now, he's not, in this one, remember, he doesn't say, I'm raising Lazarus so that others will believe. He said, I prayed this prayer so others will believe. So for them to believe that God sent Jesus, they had to have what? Heard the prayer that he prayed. Right? So he prays this prayer out loud for them to hear so they know what the plan is. Right? Or at least they know this was by design what's about to happen. Roll the stone away. And he prays this prayer to God, letting them know that he's already talked to God about this. Right? And then he says, Lazarus, come forth. Then what happens? He came forth. It's amazing. All the buildup, all the work, everything that we've done until this point. How many weeks have we been in John chapter 11? And we're just now really getting to the miracle. But the miracle itself was really pretty quick, wasn't it? Roll the stone away, prayed a prayer, and then the miracle itself. Lazarus, come forth. Here he is. The miracle itself didn't take very long. Not very long at all. I'm going to make a statement here that I think I've made before. And, we got people in this room that can refute me if I'm false. So if I say it false, make sure I'm right. Right? My understanding is no one who's ever been clinically dead, I don't mean like stopped breathing, heart stopped, that kind of thing. I mean no one who's ever reached like zero on the electroencephalograph where your brain has completely stopped functioning. No one has been brought to life, back to life from that point, medically speaking. Right? Once the brain's dead, you're gone. Am I right on that? Yeah. Once the brain's dead, you're gone. There's no coming back from that. Right? It's impossible. We can pump all of the medications in you we want to, and you're just going to bloat you up. But Jesus brought him back from that. 4 days in the tomb, he's starting to stink. I mean, this man he's deader than a doornail. But he's walking out of there alive. And then Jesus said to them, unbind and set free. Remember, we talked about the wrappings. He's going to have wrappings on him, and the wrappings are going to be of sufficient size that if he swells up, because a lot of people say, well, if he's tied up, and they think of this concept of a movie mummy, and how they're all wrapped up like this, and they're very tight, and you mostly see those on cartoons, don't you? Or like old movies from the 1950s. I'm thinking like Three Stooges kind of stuff, But that's what they think about when they think about a mummy, right? Is they're all wrapped up like this and they can't move, and so, well, how could he come out of a tomb if he's like that? But that's not how he was bound. Remember, they were bound enough that the bandages, the bindings, when the body began to swell, would not cut into the flesh, and pierce or tear the flesh, right? So he would have been free enough that he could have, of his own ambulatory abilities, made his way out of the tomb. Unbind and set free. Take these things off of him and let him go. Right? What is the biggest fear of humanity? By and large? Being buried alive. Death, dying. In any way, dying is the thing that humans fear the most. You think about horror movies, right? These scary movies, and they don't really make a whole lot of horror movies anymore. I mean, when I was a kid, it was all these slasher movies. These Friday the 13th, a guy in a hockey mask chasing you around with a big old knife and killing you in horrible ways, or people chasing you with chainsaws, and everybody was afraid. The reason they were so scary was because what if that guy's after me and he kills me, right? I mean, people are afraid to die. Afraid to die. That's the biggest fear, the biggest enemy that mankind has, right?
Well, one thing we need to realize that Jesus has defeated the enemy. Now, Hebrews, I think 2:14 and 15, he says that I'm paraphrasing, he destroyed the person who had the power of death.
Right.
Which is the devil. And he has freed us from that fear, the fear of death. He has set us free. So when we face death with victory in Jesus.
That's exactly right. I went over to 2 Corinthians instead of 1 Corinthians. Yes. So what enemy is there that Jesus has not defeated? I mean, you think about this. Ouch. Jesus even says, or Paul says so much through the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, right? He says that the enemy, the final enemy, the last enemy to be defeated is death, right? But what has Jesus made of death? A footstool, right? A footstool, right? The thing we fear the most, God uses as a footrest. Now, of course, not physically, right? I mean, but when you think about someone with his feet propped up on a footstool, what do you think about? Somebody who's working hard? Somebody who's afraid? I mean, it's like this. I love my daughter Bethany and her husband Shane, and they have this dog named Carol. And this dog named Carol, her head is as high as this thing right here. She's called a Doggo Argentino, if you've never heard of it. They are massive. Massive. Her head literally is as big as my head, right? She is a big dog, and her mouth, when it opens, I can just imagine it's as big as a lion. I mean, it could just about swallow, my head. And I can imagine this dog opening up her mouth and biting me right on the head and her teeth sinking into my neck, right? Why can I imagine that? Because this dog is mean. She's a mean dog. And she would bite. How do I know she'd bite? Because she tried to eat me one time. I'm not kidding you. I knocked on the door. I had some keys that I was taking over for a car that they were using. And I'm standing outside of the screen door because I know this dog. So I'm standing outside. Shane opens the door just enough for me to reach in. That dog saw me outside that door, attacked the door. The door flew open. Shane reached up like this and caught the dog this far away from my belly. Mouth wide open, gonna eat me. Right? Here's one thing I will tell you right now. When I go to their house, I am not propping my feet on Carol's back. I ain't going to do it. Because I'm scared and I am not comfortable when she's in the room. Death. What is it? I mean, it's just a stepping stone to life. It's just the next hurdle that we have to climb to get to the place we want to go. That's all it is. There is no fear in death. Why?
Because the sting of death is sin, and Jesus, in Christ, our sins have been taken away. So he no more have hold on us.
That's right. It no more has a hold on us. No more has a hold on us. That's exactly in 1 Corinthians 15. Oh, death, where's your victory? Oh, death, where's your sting? Right? Death has been swallowed up in victory. The victory of whom? Of Christ. And since it's the victory of Christ, then by proxy, it's the victory from everyone who is in Christ. Right? That's right. That's right. We'll go back to Hebrews again and talk about Hebrews for just a minute. In Hebrews, what we have, especially in the beginning of Hebrews, is that contrast of the priests of the Old Testament and the high priesthood of Christ, right? And the high priest is called the archierus. Arch means high, right? The first one, and hierus would in that instance would be the priest, right? So you got the archierus, the high priest, but Jesus is called the hierus megon, right? So you got the high priest, but Jesus is the hierus megon. Have you know anybody named Megan? Megan? Megan is from this word in Greek, megon. You know what it means? It means great. So if you know somebody named Megan, whether she's good or not, her name means great. So you got the high priest, but Jesus, in contrast to that, is called the great priest. Right? So he's a notch above. Well, several notches above. We can't measure how much above He is than they ever were, because He's God, right? You think about this great priest and the contrast between the two. And here's one of the contrasts that the Hebrew writer draws out. He talks about the sacrifices that took place, And there were always sacrifices. There were always burnt offerings. There were always sin offerings. There was always an animal to be killed throughout the Old Testament. From the time it was initiated until the end, there were not enough animals for the sins and the offerings that Israel owed to God. So the priests were never able to rest. But where is Jesus depicted in Hebrews? What is He doing? Is He up there working hard? What's He doing? At the right hand of God, but He's doing what? Sitting. He's seated. Now, if you got a lot of work to do, are you going to be sitting in a chair? But Jesus is seated. Why? Because He's finished His job. He's completed His task. Right? He's seated at the right hand of God. A lot of times, we just think, oh, that means He's up there with God. And it does mean He's up there with God. Why? Because He is God. And when He did that perfection, He prayed in John, restore to me the glory with which I had before. He's been restored to that glory that He had before He came down and humbled Himself, taking on the form of a man. He's been restored to that glory in heaven, right? But the rest of the story is, He's done everything that He was tasked to do.
And that's on the cross. When He said it is finished, He died.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Tetelestai is the word that He used in John chapter 19. Tetelestai. What does that mean? It is finished. That's how it's translated. And that's as good a translation as you're going to find in an English Bible, because it flows smoothly off the English tongue. It is finished, right? But it doesn't fully carry forward the idea presented in the word tetelestai. Tetelestai is what we call a perfect. A perfect means it's got past action, right? Something that was done in the past. The action is completed in this instance, but it has an ongoing significance, right? It's already been done, but the force or the significance of the action that was done continues. Right? And it's in the passive. It's a third person passive perfect. Third person, you remember I, me, us, we, that's first person. You, that's second person. He, she, or it, that's third person. That's where we are. We're living in the he, she, or it. It's third person singular. It has been. And then tetelestai comes from the Greek word teleo. Teleo means I perfect. Right? Telos, perfect, complete. Almost every time you see the word perfect in the Bible, or mature or complete, it's a form of this word telos. Right? What did Jesus say? I came not to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill it. Same thing He says on the cross. It has been fulfilled.
That's the same thing He told the apostles in Luke 24.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 40-something. That everything that the Psalm, the Lord, the Psalm, and the prophet said about Him, He has fulfilled those things.
That's right. That's right.
So He went for them to wait in Jerusalem until they have power from on high, so they can start the gospel.
Right.
Everything will start in Jerusalem.
That's exactly right. Jesus told them essentially the same thing. Everything that, you see, the Old Testament was all about Jesus, right? The coming of Jesus. All of the prophecies, everything that was leading to Jesus. Even that prophecy to Abraham, that through his seed all nations would be blessed. And that's the very point, the purpose of, the Jewish nation. The Israelites, the Jews, those in Judea. All that He did that we read about in Nehemiah and Esther and Ezra, all of that stuff was leading to Jesus. Right? All of that stuff was about Jesus. So everything from Genesis to Malachi, all of that stuff, Jesus said, I did it. I accomplished every single thing in there that had anything to do with me. Even down to the jot or tittle, right? I mean, you think about that. In Greek, there's a thing called an iota subscript. An iota subscript is it looks like a little I, and it's very small, and it goes under their letters, right? It's going to go underneath another vowel, and it's just the tiniest mark that they have. And what he's saying is even those iota subscripts, those little bitty things, those little marks that sometimes seem insignificant to the reader, because you don't even understand why it's there. I fulfilled it. I fulfilled it. Right? There's nothing that I left out. So he's finished his work. He's finished his work so that at the end of time, when he says to our physical bodies, everybody who's left, unbind and set free, they will. They will. Let me ask you another question as we're dealing with this topic today. If you think about from the history of mankind, we've already said no physical body can be raised through medicine once the brain stops to function, right? Your brain function hits zero, you're dead, that physical body is done forever. It's going to go back to the dust from which it came. That's all there is to it, right? But how many people in the history of humanity that have died physically ceased to exist? None. Not a one. Why? Because when God said in heaven, let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, He put in us something that will exist eternally. Himself. We have a soul. And the soul will not go out of existence. It's going to exist somewhere. As long as God continues to exist, we continue to exist. Right? The only question is, what's our address going to be? Right? And there are only two. There are only two. What are the two addresses? Yeah, heaven or hell. Yeah, heaven or hell. Right? We will live beside God and give Him glory and receive the glory that was given to Jesus and live with Him forever, singing His praises, hearing His praises, forever with the Lamb in the light that shines brighter than anything this world has ever seen. Or we'll be in utter darkness, in the fires of hell where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There will be no glory. There will be nothing praiseworthy. There will be only misery.
But one thing during my studies, I discovered that the devil is not in control of hell. Neither the lake of fire in Revelation, I think 41:8. He's not in control. God is in control of that eternal fire.
Right.
Matthew 25, I think 41. God prepared that fire for the devil and his angels.
Right.
They would be there, and those who don't obey the gospel, they would go there with them.
Mm-hmm.
So the devil did not create that place, and he's not in charge of that place.
That's right. That's right. We sometimes, because we call him the Prince of Darkness, right? Rightly so. He's the Prince of Darkness. He's the father of lies. So sometimes we think that since God prepared hell for Satan, that he's the boss of hell. But that's not true. That's not true. God is the boss of hell. He created it. You read over in Revelation, some of that stuff, that symbology gets a little bit confusing. But you read about that and the pit. And who puts people in the pit? Does God or does God put people in the pit, or does Satan reach up and pull them down? God puts them there, right? Who's in that pit with us? Satan, right? And if you read the Revelation, what does it explain about Satan in that pit? He's chained, right? He's limited. He's bound. By whom? By God. Remember in Job, as the sons of God are coming and talking to God and talking to Him about different things that are happening, however that works, and then who finally appears before God? And what did he have to do? What did he have to do to afflict Job? He had to get permission from God. Satan's not the boss. He's not the boss.
And these are some of the things that I do my Bible study on the telephone when people are trying to alert them to these truths.
Here's the problem that we get into when we think about things like this. We were talking at CYC about listening for God. Not listening to, right? Listening for. And one of the problems in listening for God in our lives is that there are distractions. There are other voices. Now understand, it wasn't one of those things where he's saying if you go off to a quiet place, Jesus says God is going to whisper in your ear. It was nothing like that, okay? He didn't go there. But what he was saying was so many times in our lives, we fail to look for and find those opportunities that God has given us in our lives because we're not listening for God. Right? So here's what happens a lot of times is those distractions make it into our theology. Here's how we get this concept that Satan is the boss of hell. It comes from mythology. Right? Who supposedly, according to Greek mythology, is the boss of the place of the dead? What's his name? Hades, right? And so we take this concept of Hades being the boss of the place of the dead, we understand the word Hades is in the Bible, and it is, right? And it refers to what? The place of the dead. It's the equivalent of the Greek Sheol. The Hebrew Sheol. Sheol is in the Old Testament and Hades in the New Testament. Pretty much the same thing. Right? Sheol has a little broader scope because I'm not sure they fully understood the concept of heaven and hell divided out like that, but be that as it may. The place of the dead in Greek mythology is ruled by a man named Hades. So that concept of Hades being the boss of the place of the dead found its way throughout the years into Christianity, and we kind of associate Hades with Satan. And so then, we've developed this concept that Satan is the boss of hell, which completely disregards, teaching of the Scriptures. It's one of the many voices that are out here that are saying, listen to this, believe this, that is not true. If I'll tell you one on myself. When I make it to heaven and I meet Abraham, Moses, if he doesn't look like Charlton Heston, I might be a little disappointed. One of the common misconceptions from the movie The Ten Commandments is that Moses was about to be made Pharaoh. The Scripture never says anything of the sort. Was he called a prince of Egypt? Yes, because he lived was raised by the royal family. In reality, when he was younger, he probably lived in his mother's house until he was weaned. Right? So, this concept that she didn't know who he was or there was some kind of disconnect there, it's not true. It's not true. And it's also, my friends, it's not true that Pharaoh would have mistaken Moses for an Egyptian because the looks would have been dissimilar enough that he would have known better. He would have known different. Right? So, while I like the movie, and I think Yul Brynner is the perfect Pharaoh character, but it's got some falsehoods in it, right? They take license in these movies to make them watchable, right? They dress it up so that people will like seeing it. And they say things that just aren't true. Right? So we allow sometimes these voices, these distractions, to draw our attention away, and we listen to the wrong things. We hear the wrong things. Right? And when they make it into our theology, then they can take us off course and take us the wrong direction. But you're 100% right, Sam. He is not. Satan is not the boss, really, of anything.
Satan has the ability to create.
Has the ability to what?
To create.
To create? I don't think he does. The only...
He tried to destroy
Yeah.
what God has created, by lies and deception and all these things.
Yeah.
For people to follow him.
The term create is different from the term make or build, right? The term create in the Bible is you take something, basically you make it from nothing, right? I'll tell you a story to help illustrate that. This guy one time was having an argument with God, and he said, the way that you made man, it was just so bad. I could have done a better job at building man than you. And so they got in this argument. Well, what would you have done different? The guy said, well, I do this and I do that. And God said, well, if you can do better, please, by all means, go ahead. And so the guy bent down and picked up a handful of dirt, and God said, use your own dirt. The difference between create and make. When we make or build, we take somebody else's stuff and we reform it to build something else, right? That's making or building. To create is to bring it from nowhere and to give it existence. Man can't do that. Satan cannot do that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? Satan himself is a created being. And the created do not have the ability to create. Just the reality. All right, wonderful, wonderful discussions. We'll pick up in verse 45, Lord willing, next week.